Well, good morning, everyone. I'm delighted that you have joined us for this Multiply Mini, developing a discipleship pathway to strengthen your church. My name is Rachel Billups. I happen to have the honor of serving as the senior pastor of New Albany United Methodist Church in New Albany, Ohio. These Multiply Minis are relevant, timely trainings to multiply our impact. Now, just a little Zoom etiquette today. We want you to stay muted unless you're talking, of course. And want to encourage you to use the chat for conversation and questions. And feel free to turn off your video if you need to. Now, you can adjust your Zoom screen by adjusting it to speaker view and shared screen and all those kinds of things. But I really want to get to talking about our speaker today. Matt Lake serves as the lead pastor of First United Methodist Church of Williamsport, PA. Now, his church is an urban congregation that it consists of a mix of traditional and contemporary worship experiences. First Church has grown to include a network of Fresh Expressions ministry called the Acts Network, in which people meet in places such as homes and gyms and coffee shops. Matt, it sounds so exciting. He's got his BA from Messiah University, his MDiv from Duke Divinity School. I can't believe I messed that up. Are you serious? Shout out to Duke Divinity School. And an MDiv from Portland Seminary. Matt's doctoral work included a focus on how to create a culture of discipleship that entire congregations could align around. Matt has worked with a variety of churches in a consultant role and has a passion to see God's kingdom lived out through transformed lives and the love and discipleship of Jesus Christ. He adores his beautiful wife, Jennifer, and is doing his very best to keep up with his three energetic, amazing children, Alexandra, Joshua, and Zach. We'll be monitoring the chat the entire time, so it's a great place to ask questions throughout our time together. You put your questions or anything you might want to say in the chat, and we'll keep an eye on them for the entirety of our group. Now, before Matt gets started, I just want to offer us a prayer. So let's pray. Lord Jesus, in this season of sometimes uncertainty, we want to be as effective as possible at making disciples for the transformation of the world. And so, God, I just pray that you would pour out your Holy Spirit on our time here together today. Bless Matt. Just give him clarity of mind and voice. And God, whatever he shares, may it just be a source of inspiration and encouragement to us all. We pray this and we claim this in Jesus' name. And everybody said, amen. Take it away, Matt.
Awesome. Rachel, thank you so much. It is really great to be with all of you today. I have a soft spot in my heart for West Ohio. I've had a chance to be there a few times, and so see some familiar faces. And I was just saying, if you were jumping on a little bit in the last few moments here, I'm really grateful as a Penn State fan that I get to share with you before the game this weekend and not after the game. Because I'm not sure what I think I do know what the results will be. So I'm glad that I get to be with you on this end. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to share my screen here with you. And it would help me out if you all could give me a thumbs up that you can see that okay? Everything good? Awesome. Thank you. So Rachel, thanks for the prayer as well. And similar to all of you, I mean, I am very passionate about discipleship. And I think in the time in which we live, this is one of the absolute crucial elements that we need to be looking at in the lives of our churches. One of the things that's important to me in discipleship as an individual, but in our congregation as well, is just really discipleship is about being in relationship with God and then ultimately with others. And so some of you I know a little bit, but just to give you a little bit of a sense of who I am, these are my kids and my family. And so that's our son Josh there, clear to the left of the screen. And then it's my wife Jennifer in the middle there. And she's an executive director. She founded a nonprofit called Dwell, which is for adoptive and foster care families. And she's done that in the last 4 years and just seeing some really great things happen with that. That's my daughter, Alex, there in the yellow. She's currently a junior at Penn State, studying nursing. And then my other son, Zach. He and Josh are seniors this year and in the midst of figuring out where they're going to go next year. If they decide they want to come to Ohio, we'll let them, but I don't know how much we're encouraging that. But so no, I'm just kidding. Love you all, love West Ohio. But it's always important for me. I want you to have a sense of context. Again, when we're talking about discipleship, it always happens in the context in which we find ourselves. And so this is part of my context. Here's the other significant part of my context. Rachel referenced First Church, and it's United Methodist Church in Williamsport, Pennsylvania. you probably do not know Williamsport, Pennsylvania, unless you follow the Little League World Series, in which case you might know it. Because that's where it happens every year for about 2 weeks of the year. Everybody here gets all excited as the eyes from ESPN turn upon us and share the Little League World Series with the world. But I show these pictures here on the screen because it gives you a sense that we are a church that meets on Sunday mornings in a normal traditional worship experience. But we're also a church that meets in different places, like Rachel said, whether that's at homes or in gyms or different places of worship that are not traditional spaces. And then obviously online and having that opportunity, and especially since COVID, that is something that has developed. So how do we foster discipleship in all of these ways so that we're part of the same church, but relating in lots of different ways? And that's a lot of what we're going to jump into here today. This is like anything. I just want to invite you. I know that you all are busy. I know that you have a lot of things going on, but I just invite you to do whatever you need to be fully present in these moments. And no problem at all if you want to shut your screen off or listen to whatever else you're doing. I just also know we get out what we put in. And so hopefully these next couple of minutes are helpful to you. We're going to take some time to look at the overall issue of discipleship and really why it's so important in the lives of our churches. But then we're also going to spend some time starting to unpack that and have some practical examples and takeaways of what that can begin to look like in our respective settings. So that's a little bit of where we're going, and along the way, we're going to have a chance to interact with each other. We'll make sure we take a break and stretch a little bit and then have good conversation with each other. So to help us get started with that, I want to first of all show you a commercial. Maybe some of you have seen this commercial, but before I even comment on it, I just want to invite you to watch it. It's an IKEA commercial from Europe, and it'll be pretty self-explanatory, but just see what happens in the commercial and take note of it as you watch. So let's watch it together.
Empieza algo nuevo.
All right. Now, if we had more time and we're all together, I would love to just have some conversation about that commercial. I think in so many ways, there are so many parallels to lives in our churches today. But what I really want to ask us to focus on today, I mean, if you notice throughout that commercial, like watching that gentleman as he took his red chair and literally around the world and experienced new things and tried some new things, it was fascinating to me. He actually becomes more alive. I don't know if you even noticed as he was going through, he needed his glasses at the beginning. He did not need them later on. There's kind of this wonderful transformation as he starts to experience some things. But one of the things that I want to invite us to think about as you watch that commercial, I think that gentleman showed us a pretty powerful pattern that I want to invite us to do a little bit in here today. And that is, first of all, you noticed there was an observation point. He noticed that there was a problem on the bench that was already full. And so he's observing this problem. Now, he could have just observed it and stopped there. He could have observed it and threw his hands up and said, nothing else I can do. But he didn't just observe it. He observed what was happening, and then he made some interpretations. He started to think about, what are some other things that I can do? And what would allow, more space to sit? What's another solution to the problem that I'm facing where there is no place to sit? And of course, then that led him to intervene. That led him to take some action. And he was intentional to look for something else. And that something else was taking the action of finding the red chair. And then ultimately, this red chair, unbeknownst to him, ends up literally taking him into this whole new life and taking him around the world and to experience things he never otherwise would have experienced. And again, I want to invite us today just to pay attention to that pattern, this observing. So for us, observing this issue of discipleship, and we have a choice in that. We can either throw our hands up and say, hey, if discipleship isn't happening the way that we want, we can just sort of say, woe is us. Or we can say, well, we've got these discipleship issues and problems before us. And I'll admit to you today, I'm making an assumption that all of us can grow in our discipleship. If you're here and you feel like discipleship is happening in your churches exactly the way you want and to perfection, our time probably won't be overly helpful. So I'm making the assumption that there's some discipleship issues that we are all facing and that we all want to grow in. But then when we face those issues, we also have some interpretation to do. Like, what's going on? What's causing the struggles in our discipleship? How do we better live into discipleship? But even that, just to make some interpretations, is not going to be overly helpful unless we actually intervene, unless we take some steps, unless we become intentional ourselves. And so that's what I want to invite us to do today a little bit, is just do some observing, some interpreting, and then ways that we can intervene together with one another. And my hope is that this is really what we'll start to do that will be contagious in a way among all of our congregations, that we're going to be engaged in prayer as we're observing. We're going to be then interpreting and bathing that in prayer and then intervening. And at its most simple level, to me, this is what the heart of getting at discipleship in the ways that we want, and especially from a congregational perspective, is really all about. So keeping that in mind, the first thing I want to do is I want to invite us just to observe a little bit. And some of these are things that I'm guessing you would be familiar with. But just to be really clear and to make sure we're all on the same page, my guess is that when it comes to disciple making, most of us would agree on most components of the why and the what. But I would also guess it's the how that we tend to struggle a lot with. So just to be, again, really, really clear, the first thing I want to do when it comes to discipleship, in Matthew 28, we hear, then the 11 disciples went to Galilee to the mountain where Jesus told them to go. When they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. Then Jesus came to them and said, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. Here is a strong reason for our why. Jesus says, make disciples. We know that, we understand that, but we need to realize how important it is considering Jesus himself told us this. And then I love this comment by Alan Hirsch when he says that because discipleship is intrinsic to the life of the church and a central aspect of the church's mission in the world, then its effective removal in our church's ministry must surely be a cause of much of the problems we face now. How can we possibly be the church that Jesus intended us to be if we don't follow one of the central aspects of his practice, let alone obey his explicit commands? So again, discipleship is not optional. It is absolutely crucial to who we are. And if we wonder at times why our churches are not as healthy as they could be, almost always, if not always, the core issue there is probably rooted in a lack of discipleship at one level or another. So when we're talking about discipleship, just again, to be super clear, we're talking about a desire to follow Christ. We're talking about decisions in our lives to realign our lives in accordance with who Jesus is. We're talking about both the passion and the experience and the heartfelt experience of walking with Christ, but also the willful commitment. So getting beyond just our feelings in that, but embracing it because we know what God has called us to do. And then the effects of genuine discipleship always include more discipleship. So when we're healthy in our discipleship, disciples make disciples. Therefore, if we do not have a setting where disciples are making disciples, we again have to ask the question, how healthy is our discipleship? And again, just to be super, super clear, when we're talking about disciple for our purposes today, we're talking about somebody who's following Jesus, somebody who's being transformed by Jesus, and someone who's committed to the mission of Jesus. And if we can help people live into this kind of definition, I believe we can be very confident that great things will be happening where we are in terms of discipleship. We know, though, that there's a lot of unhealth right now when it comes to discipleship. And so just to help us understand some of the effects of our lack of health in discipleship, I want us to realize some things like this, that in 2020, 47% of Americans said they belong to a church. However, that was down 23% since 1999. So in the 21 years there, from 99 to 2020, a significant drop. And then, and I'm sure many of us are experiencing this even now, 1 in 3 practicing Christians dropped out of church completely at the beginning of COVID-19. Again, if discipleship is core to who we are and discipleship in the life of the church is core to who we are, it's disturbing that this many folks, when there was a break in the life of the church, simply dropped out. Will McRaney notes that only 1% of churches in America are growing by conversion. That says to me that we do not have disciples making disciples. This also means that many churches that are growing, not all of them, but many of them are growing because members of one church are shifting to another. That's not by conversion. That's not disciples making disciples. And then this one especially hits me, and I don't know how it is for you, but when we're talking about the increase of nones, those with no religious affiliation, notice that every age category here had an increase in percentage in the nones in that age category. So 18 to 29-year-olds saw a 12% increase in nones. 30 to 39-year-olds saw a 15% increase in nones. I am particularly struck by this one, that in the 40 to 49 age group, 19% increase in nones. And then you got the 50 to 59-year-olds, 13%, and 60 to 69-year-olds, 13%. Again, those are striking numbers, and I just share those with you. It is clear that we have a discipleship problem as a whole. And so this is all part of our observing. And I love the way that J.R. Briggs says it. He says, men and women, we don't have a leadership problem. Obviously, leadership's important, but he says, we don't have a leadership problem in the church. We don't have a money problem. And again, money is important in the life of the church. He said, we don't have a participation problem in the life of the church. What he says is we have a discipleship problem in the church. And I am increasingly convinced that as we can address the discipleship problem, so we can address the general health of our church, which then stems back to all those other elements that JR lists. Neil Cole says it this way. He's even more direct. He says, ultimately, each church will be evaluated by only one thing, its disciples. Your church is only as good as its disciples. It does not matter how good your praise, your preaching, your programs, or your property are. If your disciples are passive, needy, consumerist, and not moving in the direction of radical obedience, your church is not good. Now, every single time I read that, that is a striking statement to me. And there's no, beating around the bush there. Like Neil gets right to it. I think there's definitely truth in what he shares there. And part of what I think we're facing when it comes to this issue of discipleship and the problems around it is I would want to name for us that discipleship has become a wicked problem. And a wicked problem are things that by their very nature, they're multi-layered, they're multifactorial. They contain many layers of issues which have to be addressed. And all of those issues are happening at one time and no longer in sequential order. So that means there's not an easy solution. There's not just a magic bullet, a quick program to fix this all. And just as the problems are multi-layered, so the response must also be multi-layered. And that's what we're going to look into here today with discipleship, of how we can begin to address it at multiple layers in the lives of our congregations. Now, to make this a little bit more personal, and I don't know how much this will relate directly to you all, but I just want to share a little bit of our own story in this, because discipleship has been something, yes, I'm super passionate about it, but we've certainly had and continue to have our own issues around discipleship and how we can live into it. So as I said earlier, this is a picture of one of our facilities. This is where we meet on Sunday morning. And for a long time, the way that First Church grew is that it was able to do programs with more excellence than any place else, or at least in our local area. And so we were also able to offer more programs than others. And we actually even became rather known. Like we can offer a good youth group, and we can offer good children's program, and we can offer you name it. We could do it well. And because we could do those programs well, people came. And for a while, that worked really well. Like if we offered enough programming and did it well, they would come. And at the same time, we were very staff driven. And so whether it was just one pastor in the setting or you have a multiple individuals, a lot of staff, we could rely on our staff that, again, if we have good staff with good preaching and they're doing a good job leading the programs, that all would go well. But what we started to notice was that no matter what we did with our programming, no matter how good it was, even if we had the best staff and even if they were doing a great job, what we started to notice was that we were getting less and less return for our investment. So it seemed like we were having to work harder and harder and harder to get the same results. And in fact, the harder we worked, we started to even see less results, like less people showing up on the weekends, less people in our life groups, less people taking discipleship seriously. And I just really began to scratch my head around like, well, how do we address this? Like, what do we do? And my tendency, if you know me at all, is I tend to just try harder. I want to do what we're doing, except do it even harder. And I'm going to dig in even harder. And I did that for a while, only to continue to see it wasn't working. And finally, I would say, by God's grace, a couple things happened in our setting that were well beyond me. Like I'd love to say to you all today, in my great wisdom, I figured out what was wrong and we tweaked it and fixed it, and now everything is well. But that's not what happened. A couple factors beyond my own control happened. And when they did, we began to realize a couple things that I want to share here with you. We were understanding, and this all again falls under the category of observing, like we're observing our context and where we are. We started to notice that because of the busyness in people's lives, excellence of programs no longer carried the day. It was just good for us to name that for ourselves. It didn't mean our staff were doing a bad job or anything like that. It's just people's lives were busy, and that was going to impact their level and their commitment in their discipleship. We also began to notice that the life cycle was shifting as the culture shifted. And so there was just a different rhythm. So whereas Sunday mornings used to be mainly protected, people now have traveling, and they've got traveling sports obligations, and they've got vacations, and they're exhausted from the week, and no longer was Sunday morning just protected. And so that meant we couldn't just assume that people would have open space to join us on Sunday mornings. And so what was our response to that going to be? And we also noticed this, that we had been spending all of our energy on what I would say was creating good church volunteers and not rugged disciples for Jesus Christ. And we're going to dig more into that. But this is part of our observing so that we could start to understand what the issues and the problems facing us were. This became most acute to me when a number of years ago, I had created what I thought was the most robust discipleship program we had ever had. And we took a number of our folks through it. And one of the individuals in our setting, he's one of our most mature individuals, got through, and on the very last night of this discipleship program that I had created, that I thought was really good, he walked out and he looked at me, and he wasn't trying to be mean or critical, but his response to me was, "Is this all there is?" And when he asked that question, it was just one of those moments that just, first of all, floored me. I'm like, what do you mean? I just gave you the best of what we got. And his question was, is this all there is? And what that led me to, and listening and trying to observe, was the reality that I had done a really good job creating a program of information about discipleship to raise up volunteers. What we had not done is create a discipleship experience to help raise up what we would call rugged disciples. And so it caused us in many ways to go back to the drawing board. So when we look at all of this, one of the first things I want to ask you all, I'm going to ask you to respond to this in just a moment, still under this category of observing, to understand what we're facing. I think there's at least 3 layers of this discipleship problem that we're facing today. And that is, number one, a focus on quick information over patient formation. So you all know we live in a culture of instant gratification, and it's just way easier to throw a program at somebody rather than to ask them to walk through a process or an experience with you. And so how do we deal with this focus on quick information over patient formation? Secondly, there's increasingly an orientation to functioning in the institutional church as the highest ideal. So forming volunteers over disciples. In my doctoral work, I literally examined a number of pathways, discipleship pathways in churches, and the vast majority of them Their goal was to raise up good volunteers for life in the church, to be a youth group volunteer, or to hand out bulletins, or to sing in the choir, or to sit on a certain committee. Very, very rarely was there an orientation to discipleship outside the walls of the facility of the church. And what that's doing then is leading us to focus on basically irrelevant metrics. It's a focus on institutional preservation. It's a focus on seeking to remain stable and hold on in the midst of our changing world. But what it's not doing is raising up disciples equipped to make other disciples. And finally, we're noticing an absence of apostolic practices in the wider church beyond the institutional church. So in other words, there's increasingly a passive Christian spirituality. There's the focus on being cared for over caring for others. There's the idea of retreating in instead of exploring out with an apostolic tone or sharing the good news tone. We increasingly don't pioneer into new endeavors because we just want to hold on to what we have. And so for us, again, this is kind of messy, right? Like, so this, I realize even this picture is just, it's a mess, but against this backdrop of messiness and layers, we've got these multiple factors creating a discipleship problem. And so here's my question for you. And if you could take just a moment to respond to this in the chat, I would be grateful. Which of those issues right now is, observe your own context for just a moment. Which of those issues that I just walked through would you say for you is the primary barrier to discipleship right now? And you could probably make an argument for multiple ones, maybe all of them, but do you all, is it the quick focus on information over a patient formation? Is it the orientation to raising up volunteers for in the church? Or is it the lack of apostolic practices in the wider church? So if you just go ahead and pop those in the chat, I'd be grateful. Rich, thank you. So quick information for him. That's exactly right. Like we all have that focus. How about some others of you? Also quick information. Thanks, Karen. Rachel, yeah, lack of apostolic practice, good. Good, awesome. Orientation, institute, quick info. Institutional safety, yep. Institutional focus, yep. Good, 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 good. Awesome. So all of those are represented, but I definitely hear a lack of, or a focus on the quick, the focus on the institutional church, good. So here's why I'm asking you this. It's good for you all as leaders to be aware of this, but I think this is also a great conversation to begin to have with your leadership teams and to begin to ask ourselves, like, again, step one, if we know we have a discipleship problem, and I'm guessing most of us do, then what are we observing and why might that be the case? And what we're doing right now is just helping us to begin to observe that. So again, multiple layers to address. Awesome, thank you for that. So keeping that in mind, you've done this observing. Now I want to ask us to start to interpret. Like, it's one thing to name the issues that are before us. In this case, multifactorial elements, but it's good just to lay those out. What then is our interpretation of the problem? Like, what are things we can consider doing in the midst of it as a church? And as you start to think about that, I want to share a quick story here with you. A number of years ago, when I was doing my doctoral work, I was doing that with Lynn Sweet, and we had the opportunity at that time to have a trip to go to Cambridge, England, which was really fun at many levels. When we were there, Len told what for me was a fascinating story. He said that a couple years prior, his daughter had been visiting when he was in England, and they decided to go Westminster Abbey for to visit it and to see what it was like. They went on a Wednesday morning. When they went on a Wednesday morning, there was a line out the door because there were so many tourists waiting to get in. And on top of that, they had to pay, I think it was about 15 pounds, roughly $20 to get in. If you know anything about Len is not a very patient person. And he said, the last thing I'm gonna do is pay to get into a church. So he said to his daughter, we will come back another time. They came back later. They came back on Sunday morning. And when they came on Sunday morning, they came during the actual worship time. And when they came at the actual worship time, there was no line out the door. You didn't have to pay to get in. And they walk in, and it's this massive cathedral space, and there are about 150 people in there. And Len says of the 150, about 50 of them were in the choir. Another 50 were visitors who, when they realized it was a real worship service, they left, leaving only a congregation of roughly 50 people. And then Len said to us, why do you think that was the case? And we had a long conversation about it, and just kind of tried to understand some of the reasons why, and had sort of a woe is us kind of mentality, and oh, more people should be there and all this kind of stuff. But Len said something that has always stuck with me in that experience. He said, why would people come and pay for a tour guide who will take them around versus come when it's for free for the worship experience. And he made this observation. He said that when you pay for the tour guide, you're paying for two things. Number one, you're paying for somebody with the knowledge and the expertise to explain the history and the relevance of that place to you. And then number two, that tour guide will walk with you step by step by step through the journey. As we think about observing the discipleship problem, I want to suggest to us, what would it look like for us to take a multi-layered approach and say, number one, yes, we want to offer information about discipleship. But at the same time, we want to walk in an experiential way, step by step by step with people through and in discipleship. And what might that begin to look like? And as we started to have that conversation and try to do some of our own interpretation, what we started to realize in regards to congregational discipleship was this: we needed something more accessible than what we had been offering. We needed something also intentional, but also flexible and organic at the same time. We realized that a program focus only and information only focus was probably not going to work. We realized that we had to help people get in the game. So again, we're not just learning information, we want them to experience it and live it out in relevant and exciting ways. We realized we need to start raising the stakes. Instead of always lowering expectations, what would it look like to raise them and increase them? And again, multi-layered problems need multi-layered solutions. Like this all became part of our interpretation. And so for us, in relation to discipleship, we started to notice different layers that we could respond with in terms of discipleship. So number one, the layering of it, let something be both structured and flexible. Let it be both intentional, but also create space for something organic. We want formal and informal, which I'll share in a little bit. We want something that's formative, informs who we are, but we also want something generative, that is giving new life and helping us share that new life. And then, of course, we need right belief, we need orthodoxy, but we also need orthopraxy, we need right practice. And for many of us, I think a lot of times we fall on the right belief side and the information side and the formal side, at least we did in my setting, but we are missing this whole layer of organic and informal and generative and all of those things. And so again, in our interpretation around this problem of discipleship, these were elements that began to rise up for us. And to be really specific, and again, I want to invite you to start thinking about this in your own setting. When we're talking about multiple layers of discipleship, here's the one I'm guessing, it's just a guess, that most of us are probably already doing. We're offering formal elements of discipleship. So Bible studies, awesome. Worship services, especially on Sunday morning, awesome, where people can be fed and learn. We do organized mission trips, awesome, great. We focus on things like Luke chapter 4, where we see Jesus giving his first formal sermon, or the Sermon on the Mount in scripture. We see that Jesus is giving a more formal message. I want to be really clear, this is needed and there are good things. Again, this is how I see most churches trying to do discipleship. And again, we've been in that boat as well. But I think there's another whole level of discipleship, another whole layer that we've been missing, and it's this informal discipleship, which is going to allow for new life to be generated. And so what does discipleship look like when we're eating together in relationship? How do we do discipleship where we're sharing life together? How do we do discipleship where there's shared memories and experiences? In Matthew chapter 11, Jesus says, take my yoke upon you because this burden is light. Like there's this intimacy factor. You remember at the last meal, it wasn't that Jesus just told words to the individuals there, the disciples. He washed their feet. He shared in a meal with them. It was an experience. Interestingly, in scripture, if we look carefully through the Gospels, it's actually the informal discipleship where I think more time is given than the formal discipleship. If we look carefully at all the times when Jesus, after the crowds leave, that's when he was talking with his disciples. That's when they were asking questions. That's when there were these holy moments that occurred. Lots of times when the rest of the people weren't there. And so how do we begin to live into that as a church and as a congregation? And what might that look like for us? We have found, and you can use different forms, like let me be clear on that, but we have found this APEST framework to be helpful in our setting, especially around formal or informal or generative and formational. And let me just break this down for you a little bit. You're probably familiar in Ephesians chapter 4, verses 11, 12, and 13. The gifts he gave were that some would be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, some pastors and teachers to equip the saints for the work of ministry, for building up the body of Christ. So what do those 5 offices do? the work of the church. They build up the body of Christ until all of us come to the unity of faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God to maturity, to the measure of the full stature of Christ. And so there's different frameworks we can look at, but I'm going to lift just this one up today. These 5 offices of apostle, prophet, evangelist, shepherd, and teacher. And what we have found to be helpful with this is that under these 5 offices, some of the offices are what I would call more formative in nature. You've got your teachers and your shepherds. So teachers share the knowledge of God, and shepherds are caretakers and nurturers of individuals in the faith, and prophets are truth tellers. But then you've also got offices that we oftentimes do not focus on in the life of the church today, and that is apostles, those people who are entrepreneurs and pioneers and being sent out. Evangelists, those who are sharers of the good news in some regard. And again, you're going to continue to have your truth tellers, and that sometimes can lead to new life as well. But I want to emphasize for us that I think a lot of times we have focused on the formative, which in our setting we call the gathered side of who we are. But it's just as important that we focus on the generative side. These things are going to lead to new life, things that are going to help raise up other disciples where there currently aren't none. That's what we call our sent side. And again, one not better than the other. I would suggest to us that because we've taken the one layer approach to discipleship, only on the formation, only on the information, that it has caused us to not experience the generative side, new people being reached in new ways. And when you mix them together, there's this wonderful, holy synergy that can occur. And so again, for us, as we talk about interpreting all of this together, what we start to realize then is that discipleship is not a class. We don't want it to be a class. We want it to be a lifestyle. And so I would just invite you all to start to think a little bit in your own setting. Is discipleship treated more as a class or more as a lifestyle? And if it's more as a class, what needs to happen in order for it to be more of a lifestyle? To help you understand this just a little bit more, we've done this in our setting, and that is on this gathered, more formal side, there are clear strengths. And I just want to be so clear about this. It brings a stability to who we are. There tends to be a strong emphasis, at least on programmatic discipleship. There's a comprehensiveness and an organization to what we do. It tends to be more visible in the community. There's a centralization to it, and those are all great things. But there's also this sent side of who we are, and that allows us to be much more nimble than we otherwise would be. There's more of a missional impulse to share the good news. There's a specialization, there's a more personalization as one individual begins to share with another in relationship, which means it can get into these crevices of our society that the more institutional side of who we are cannot. And it's just more decentralized. It is just more messy. And again, strengths to both. We so often live in an either or world. Part of what we want to do in this approach to discipleship is learn to embrace the strengths of both of these. Think of it this way. I love this example in Matthew 14:28. Peter says to Jesus, "Lord, if it is you, tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," said Jesus. Now notice, if discipleship is about following, if discipleship is about doing what our master does, Jesus does not say, think about come on the water. He doesn't say, come up with a theory on how you would walk on water. He says, come. The expectation is that Peter will actually do it. And the reason for that is that in biblical times, disciples, they don't just know what their master knows. They do what their master does. That's not forfeiting the knowledge. It's doing and knowing. And again, at least for us, in trying to interpret this discipleship problem, we have found that for many, at least in the church, I'm not speaking to those outside, but those in the church, they often have the knowing part. They don't always have the following or the doing part. And so how can we help them live into that? Because one of the results of this is we set up our discipleship to go like this, like just one nice, straight up and to the right kind of category, but that's not real. Real life discipleship is what you see there on the bottom of the screen. You take 3 steps forward, you take 2.5 back, you take 2 back, 2 forward, maybe 2 back, and then, work your way forward. But somehow in the midst of that, in the messiness and with intentionality, God still works and moves and transforms us and makes us grow and helps us grow more and more into the image of Christ. So in a minute, I want to ask you again, just this will be another hopefully takeaway for you. I want to invite you to think a little bit about your own discipleship culture. And just the way I'm going to invite you to think about that, because this, again, we're still interpreting and starting to think about what it is we would do and how we foster discipleship. I just want to invite you to think about, in your setting, on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 not at all, 10 very, very much, how would you rank your discipleship culture? And just to give you some ideas of what that means, on the low end would be there is no formal discipleship. There's no informal discipleship. There's a whole lot of work to be done. There's a very minimal missional impulse present. Maybe you're the only one or one of a few with a heart for discipleship. Maybe the goal is to make people comfortable. I like this phrase, comfort over contending. When we contend for the faith, we live into the faith, we fight for the faith, we contend for it, but maybe that's not present in your setting. Maybe there's a strong scarcity or survival mindset where you are. Maybe discipleship is not even hardly talked about. Maybe there is no formal discipleship pathway for your congregation as a whole. Maybe there's little to no outreach happening, and you have maybe a few volunteers, but there's no new disciples really being made. If that's your setting, you're kind of in that 1 to 3 category. But then you might be in this category, and that is you're making some progress when it comes to discipleship, but you might have formal discipleship or informal discipleship. A good friend of mine recently helped start a church plant, and he tells me they have lots and lots of informal discipleship. They don't have hardly any formal discipleship. Maybe that's you in some way. There are some resources given to discipleship. There might be some programs for discipleship, but discipleship's really not a way of life. It's not in the DNA of the church. There might be a discipleship pathway of some kind, or at least a few steps. Discipleship is owned by a few people, but has not yet sunk into the DNA of the church as a whole. There might be some clear next steps for congregants to take to grow deeper in their discipleship, but not a lot, or maybe those steps aren't clear. There tends to be little congregational alignment around discipleship. There's individuals, again, but we as a congregation have not embraced this. There's genuine discipleship that's seen only for, the elite, super spiritual people. It's not seen as the regular for everybody. Discipleship is being lived out by at least a few people, though, in some good ways, which is exciting to see. Maybe there's a desire for more disciples, but we're just not sure how to get there. And maybe the primary result is still volunteers rather than disciples. And then finally, there's some commitment, but it's still rather minimal. So there might be some actual formation happening, but not a lot of generation, not a lot of new life occurring. If that's a general description of your setting, your discipleship culture, you're probably in that 4, 5, 6 range. And then finally, maybe you're in this range, which would be on the higher end, which is you've got formal and informal discipleship happening. You see new life and new disciples who are coming among you, which is awesome and exciting. Now we're actually getting to a discipleship mindset over a good volunteer mindset. That the discipleship, it's integrated into all parts of the church. Like, this is not an isolated thing owned by one person. So you've got high congregational alignment. There's a very comprehensive discipleship pathway in place. People know about it. They know the steps to take. You're sharing stories on a regular basis of how you're seeing disciples grow. And there's a lot of resource given to discipleship. It's not an afterthought in light of other things. And discipleship, we're seeing that as the norm, the expectation for even the most average person in our congregation. It's not for the super spiritual elite. So you've got a very high bar of commitment. And again, this idea of contending for the faith, we are all in. We're going to live it out to the best of our ability. We're going to commit to it and sacrifice in it rather than focus on our own comfort. That's a mark of a high discipleship mindset that we want to embrace. There's always deeper opportunities for discipleship and new life in Christ. The knowing about it and following it is occurring. So we're not just knowing about Christ, we're actually following Christ in what we're doing. Is that you? And so I literally want to invite you now just to think about that a moment and to really just kind of get that in your mind. And here's what I'm going to invite you to do. I want to invite you to assess your discipleship culture and in light of what we just shared. And I'd love to hear from you what that might be. And as you do that, just go ahead and pop that into the screen, into the chat, I mean. And here's something else that you can think about. All I want is one number from you today, but here would be something else that you can take away for yourself. Look in your setting and give yourself a ranking. How well are we doing on the formal discipleship side? How well are we doing on the informal discipleship side? And then, when you blend those two together, what's the overall discipleship culture, right? So again, this would be another great conversation to have with your leadership groups. It's especially interesting to see if you rank really high on one compared to the other and what steps we might need to take to mix those two things together, all right? So the other thing that you can think about in that then is, okay, we have a high formal discipleship journey. But low informal, what's one of the barriers that's happening there? So great. I really appreciate y'all putting these in here. Great. So I'm just going to look here a moment. Lots in the middle, some in the 3 to 4 range, 1 to 3. Great. I think 6 is the high that I'd see so far. Great. 4 to 6. Good. Yeah, thanks, Rich. A resistance to the informal among established people. Good. Good. All right. Good. All right. So let's do this. I'm gonna pause my screen here for just a second. And I'd love if one or two of you might be willing just to share briefly. Rich, can I pick on you a second? You said there's a resistance to the informal among established people. Can you say just a bit more about that for us? Like, what are you encountering that makes you say that?
So in my current role, I'm the director of international ministries for Teens for Christ. We're in 14 countries around the world, and I've got 2 of my guys here, one from Kenya and one from Nepal, who do discipleship with teenagers. But in the church, when I stepped out of the church a year and a half ago from full-time ministry, it was the idea that working with the Bonhoeffer Project and other discipleship groups, there was a severe resistance among people who said, we're already doing discipleship in Sunday school. We're already making it happen. And they had formed very close groups, but they really weren't getting the idea of ingraining the Jesus DNA into who they were and living out everyday life. In other words, new people weren't being evangelized. It wasn't a part of something that happened outside of their established social circle. So we're trying to, and I'm trying to break down my walls so that I can model that better, but it's tougher than I would have thought.
Yeah, and Rich, can I ask on that? You said something interesting. For some of these people in these close Bible study groups, I think I heard you actually say they are close together in their relationship. Is that right?
They're close in they're close, but not, they're familiar, but not close. I don't know how another way to say it, in the sense of they're a closed group. It's that conundrum of a mid-sized group. So you have a group that's too big to get close and accountable, and you have a group that's too large to feel or it's large enough that it's so small that new people don't feel welcome.
I was just right. So what I hear in that are some close personal relationships, but because they're almost so close with one another, at least at a certain level, newcomers are not welcome, whether directly or indirectly. So they're isolated from them to some degree. But I love the observation you just made. They believe they're in close community, but probably not, like, meaning, do they share deepest struggles with each other, or hold each other accountable, or push each other to new levels and commitment in their discipleship? And oftentimes that answer is also no. And so I love your description of this in the middle place, which simultaneously can exclude outsiders. And yet, even though we think we're going deep in our own discipleship walk, we're really not in as deep a community as we might think. So yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. And I think that is common across the board. Can I ask, Ali, you said you have very faithful people, deep faith, personal discipleship. They love one another, but we have anemic apostleship. Can I ask you what you mean by anemic apostleship?
I think the largest challenge that we've named here, this is my 4th year, is, this challenge that we have trouble having leaders take initiative to do things. We've got wonderful people that love each other. They walk through all of life's challenges with one another. They support each other. They support the life of the church. But as far as leading or wanting to be engaged in outreach or connecting or being sent, it's really just not happening. And I think in the past there's been program centered, but right now we lack that leadership in the apostleship.
Yeah. Ali, thank you so much. And I think what you just described is also very, very common in that, you've got these people, sort of the typical church mindset, but either they don't know how to reach out, or they are unwilling for a host of reasons, even though, like, yes, their faith, they'd say, is super important to them. But again, this inability to get beyond that. Yeah, really good. Thank you. Thanks. Any other question on that as you're thinking through this? Some comments there at the end. Yeah, thank you. Wesley's accountability groups. I mean, that would certainly be one. That would be a place to dive deeper into community with each other. But my point in that is to get below the surface level stuff, to get below just information we learn about from the Bible and actually get to the place of applying it in a way that's forcing us to go deeper in the best ways possible. So yeah, that could be a form of it. Good, appreciate that. Any other observations here? And thank you for those willing to share a little bit, but any other questions or thoughts on this observing and then this interpretation? And we're going to shift then to how as a congregation we can start to live into the interpretation through intervention and through action. Any other comments to make at this point? Yeah, Matt, thanks. He said mentioning this type of group, accountability group, scares them. Yeah, and that's just it. Like, one of the things that we've noticed in our setting is it's easy for people to think they're in deep community if they know another person's face and can say their name. To me, that is not deep community. Deep community is when we know each other's joys and struggles and walk with each other in it. Remember the example I gave with Westminster Abbey. Part of discipleship is walking in step with one another. And I know a lot of our folks, they love each other. I believe that, but I wouldn't say they necessarily walk in step with one another. And so I think you're exactly right to say that that can scare people. Yeah, thanks, Matt. Yeah, thanks, Anne-Marie. This sounds more like adaptive leadership and discipleship than technical leadership. It's a paradigm shift in how we understand being disciples and who make disciples. And yeah, that's exactly right. So again, what we've done in recent decades is we find discipleship material as a program that we then present informationally. And we expect that to translate to apostles and pioneers and shepherds and all of these things. I can't find one time in scripture where Jesus taught his disciples by saying, all right, everybody, here's my notepad, get out your pens and pencils. You're going to take a test and then you'll be full disciples. Exactly to Anne-Marie's point, there's this adaptive change and shift that must occur. So yeah, thank you for pointing that out. Rich said, often other people participate, they love it, but multiplying out is hard. They don't want to stop meeting together. Exactly. Because what the point you're making there, I use that phrase contending versus comfort. Many of us are comfortable in our discipleship. We don't necessarily contend for discipleship. So good. Sherry here, willing to invite people in ministries, groups, etc., rather than being willing to walk together to new places because we can't see how to live into the new spaces of our rapidly changing faith. And that's exactly right. So when we don't know what's out there, we cling even harder to what we know and feel comfortable with. And then Glenda, interested to hear how discipleship pathway covers many layers. Great, that is a perfect segue. So let's get to that. So here's what I invite you to do, literally for 60 seconds and no more. Just take a stand and stretch, do whatever you need to do. And then we're going to get to the last part and then have conversation together. So 60 seconds, go. All right, going to call us back here. And we're going to jump into our last portion with one another today. And then have some conversation with each other. So let me again pull my screen up. All right, so again, this whole idea, observing the problems that are out there and then interpreting those problems, experimentation, et cetera. But then again, all of that does us no good if we don't actually take some steps and to actually try some different things. And that's what I want to cover in this last part. And again, remember what I said earlier? I think a lot of us agree on the what of discipleship. I think a lot of us agree on the why of discipleship. What's very difficult is the how of discipleship, especially in the changing culture that some of you referenced. So to help us move in this direction, I want to lift up this idea, and I wish I knew who said it, but I don't. Man, this just rings so true with me. Nobody drifts into a committed, growing relationship with Christ. Nobody wakes up one day and says, I'm not sure how it happened, but without really knowing it, I'm a lot like Jesus in every area of my life. I love that because I feel like this is how we do church and discipleship so often. Like if I just hope for it, it's just going to kind of happen. So obviously then how are we going to move beyond that? So I want to do two things here of application of intervening. First, I'm going to give you a couple general things in relation to your culture, whichever one you just identified. Like here's some general action steps, ways we can start to intervene. Again, and I made these specific to whatever you listed yourself as on the cultural shift range from 1 to 10. And then I want to get really practical what it can look like in our local congregation. So if you said our discipleship culture, it's in that 1 to 3 range, the key issue there is a softening of the heart. Like we're not going to make much progress at all until we get to the condition of the heart. And so the things that I would suggest in stages 1 to 3, if that's where your discipleship culture is, are focused more on the heart. So it goes without saying, but it's just so powerful to be praying. Like we must be a people of prayer. If we're not praying about deeper discipleship, let me please say, please start. And it can begin just with us. Sounds obvious, but it's amazing how many of us don't do that. Secondly, to seek out and invest in shining eyes. And so by shining eyes, I mean those people that either currently get it or you're convinced they could get it, to just sit down with them and say, I see something in you. Would you be willing to take this step with me? Like that individual seeing and then seeking out, even if it's 2 or 3 people. Focus on a Bible study such as the Gospels or Acts or James that helps us understand the importance of doing and not just the information. Similarly, a sermon series on this kind of thing. And then begin asking questions around discipleship, especially with your key volunteers, especially with your leadership groups. Ask these questions, start to raise the temperature around it, and have conversations around discipleship. Even some of the questions that we've raised today can be simple ways to start to raise the temperature, but all of those are going to relate to the condition of the heart. If our hearts are not open to following Christ, then we're not going to follow Christ. So that's the first one. And then if you're in the 4 to 6 range, some steps you can take, you're going to continue to pray regularly. We never stop that. However, in this range, there's a little bit more health. There's a little bit more vitality going on. So begin to build upon or create an actual discipleship pathway. And I'll give you an example of that here in just a few moments. Take your next step of resource investment. I mean, whatever it would mean for you all to say, we are literally going to invest even financially towards discipleship, whether that's personnel or supplies and resources or learning experiences, but something where we're putting our money literally to say, this is important to us. What would it look like to start to pair up people who are more mature in the faith with some newer people in the faith? We have found that to be something that's brought fruit in different ways. Start to lift up examples of where you're seeing discipleship. Like, we replicate what we celebrate. Stop an ongoing program in favor of a discipleship opportunity. So right now we live in a time, I think, of overwhelm for people. What would it look like to take a thing or two off of their plate so that we can create space for discipleship focus? Discern how to improve either your formal or informal focus. So maybe you're already doing great on the formal. What would it look like to develop the more messy, the more relational, the adaptive shift that Anne-Marie was lifting up? And then vice versa. If you feel like you're really good on the informal, how do you do more of the formal? And then communicate your discipleship opportunities clearly and regularly. Communication is hard. People have so much coming at them all the time. How regularly are we giving people clear opportunities to take their next step in discipleship? And the key issue here is there may be a heart for discipleship, but now we're going to think through it. So I think the key issue here is the mindset around discipleship. And then I might have missed it, but I didn't see anybody in this category. But if you do feel like you're getting close to, like, we have a lot of healthy discipleship focus going on, you're going to keep on praying, but now you're going to lift up even more stories and again, do even more celebration of discipleship. And you're going to foster more and more organic mentoring and apprenticing. The other thing that you want to start to do here is highlight generation, that is new life, as a result of the formation. So it's great when people are being formed in the faith, but whatever we can do to help people see new life is occurring from it, we want to do that. You want to share contending, that is living into the faith, sacrificing in the faith over comfort. We want to create even a more robust congregational discipleship pathway. So maybe you already have one, but what's going to take it to the next level to help people to get at some of these elements we're talking about? What does an annual sermon series on this look like? What does a flywheel of formation and generation look like on an ongoing basis, so that we're no longer just hoping for discipleship, we're expecting discipleship? And the key issue here is now you have the heart for it, you've thought through it, you're thinking through it, you're going to build on that momentum and build as much momentum as you can. So I lift those things up in general that you can apply in your setting today. But let me walk you through for just a few moments, and then we're going to have some conversation together. A very specific model of a congregational model of discipleship. And this is what we've adapted in the last number of years. And again, a lot of this is based on the doctoral work that I did. And it's a combination of experimenting where we are, of the work that I've done, of failing along the way. This is what we're doing. So it's these 4 steps of connecting, discovering, embracing, and multiplying. And you'll see that even as I list that, we try to be super clear about what we mean for discipleship. That is, we seek to create disciples in our context, committed to our vision of transformation in Christ. And this means living into a dual expression of church that includes both the gathered and sent communities. So that's our way of saying that includes both formational and generational new life communities. So what do I mean by that, and what does that look like? For us, we call it Disciples' Journey. And a disciple's journey, it's a series of 4 learning experiences through which participants both learn about. So we're going to have the formal side, we're not getting rid of that, but they're also going to participate in through practices that are generative in nature, with the goal of disciples making disciples. Like, we want to be clear from the beginning, that's what we mean by discipleship in our setting, to live into that. That's the overview of it. But what does it actually look like? It looks like this. So first of all, step 1 is about connecting with God and connecting with each other. And my guess is that many, if not all of you, have this step. This is really where people join. Some churches call it the new member class. And again, the goal is to connect with God and each other. And all we're trying to do here is start to lay out the DNA of our church, to lay out formal versus informal, like we're planting seeds of what is to come. Now, I will say to you, we have intentionally made the barrier low to joining in the life of our church, or to connect, I should say, in the life of our church. And you're going to see we have very high expectations, but we wanted a low barrier for people coming into the church, because we believe this: if you connect with us and you connect with God in this place, God is going to lead you to ever deeper places. So if we make too many barriers on the front end, we feel like we will miss out on that opportunity. So these are 4 sessions that we do, and we usually do this 3 times a year. And so there's these clear entry points throughout the year that people can take this step 1. Again, you probably do that in some regard in your setting. You might even do this step in your setting, and that is, in our step 2, we do it in the fall of each year. It's 6 sessions, and it's all about discovering your spiritual gifts and talents and passions, and how those can be used for the kingdom of God. And the object here is to explore discipleship in a way where you start to utilize the gifts you've discovered. Now, again, my guess is that many of you do this in some regard. Like, maybe you have people take spiritual gift inventories and those kinds of things. Great. This is still mostly formational on our side, but we're still sewing in that APEST idea. And I'll unpack that in just a moment. We're not just looking to get people to find out their gifts to fill our slots. What we're trying to do is to help them find their gifts as part of the body of Christ, and then to help them be free to live those out. That's a big difference. If you love accounting work, we're not going to try to force you to sing in the choir. There's another place for you to be. If you love a new adventure and connecting with people, we're not going to try to stifle you on a committee. So this is about learning who they are so that they can discover their giftedness to apply in the body of Christ. We are big believers. If everybody does their thing, whatever that is, all the needs will be taken care of. So this is not about filling our programs or our volunteerism. It's about setting them free in their giftedness. And again, you probably have some version of this. Where I've noticed the biggest difference, though, is into this next step, our step 3. We do this in the spring of every year. It's 9 sessions. And here it's about embracing God's call on your life as a leader or as a servant leader. And here the focus is less on information and more about practice. So things like everybody who takes step 3, they come and they share their testimony. Now that may not sound like that big a deal. I can't believe how many people who've been in the church, sometimes for decades, who say, I've never shared my testimony. If they're not used to sharing their testimony or sharing their faith with anyone ever, how's it going to be possible at the right time to share that with people they're trying to connect with? We invite them to be praying for people that they will be able to share good news with or to walk with step by step. We dig deeper into APEST and help them understand how they're wired and how that might be able to be lived out. We have them meet with our staff, and wherever they might potentially feel called to grow in their faith, they literally meet with our staff or a key person, or maybe a volunteer. It doesn't have to be staff, but whoever's helping lead a certain ministry to keep learning, and we connect them in that way. They're praying along the way, they're reading along the way, like they're doing all of these things that what we're trying to do is set them up for that one thing that they are willing to embrace. And it's the shift from, I'm just going to be a part of this, to I'm willing to own it. Like, I'm willing to be all in on it. I'm willing to help get other people who are going to be part of this with us. And we explore those kinds of things with them. Here's what I have not seen. I mean, this step 3, it's what I haven't seen in other churches. It almost always stops with elements of our step 2. This step 3, though, is where we start to see the generation, the new life, because they're putting into practice things we've been talking about. And then what's really cool for us is we end up literally having a portfolio on every person who goes through these steps. And so we can go back at any time, and because I don't remember for everybody, what was their giftedness? What did that look like? What were they passionate about? Are they still having a chance to live into that? And it's really a pretty wonderful thing. We do spiritual and gift inventories, but we do strength finders. We do APEST testing. We ask them for their own passions. I mean, we have a pretty comprehensive portfolio on them by the time we're done with it. And based on what they share, we invite them into opportunities as well, but it's based on their giftedness, not on our needs. I want to be really clear about that. And then finally, we invite people, if they feel so led, into what we call our step 4. And what that has consisted of for us recently is going through a creativity cohort that we've designed, but then an ongoing apprenticeship model where they're meeting with their mentor, and literally for a good 2 years to 3 years, they're meeting with this person who checks in with them on what they're embracing their call around and how that's going and how we can offer mentorship and all of that. And the ultimate idea and goal is that if these discipleship 3 and 4 people are really living as disciples, they will have an opportunity at some point to invite people back into this, which is the step 1, and begin from there. These steps 3 and 4, again, are the things we've noticed that are different from what we've seen in other places. It's the shift from volunteer to actual discipleship. But we need steps 1 and 2 because those are formative in nature as well. So that's how the process looks for us. And then it becomes this. This is a yearly thing for us. 3 times a year, you've got Disciple Journey 1 happening. In the fall of every year, we do this Disciples Journey 2 about discovering who God made you to be. In the spring of every year, embracing that giftedness. And then the goal is multiplication, where we're starting to set these people free. If you get to Disciples Journey 4, we trust you know our DNA, we trust you, we realize what your giftedness is, and we're willing to empower you and give you permission and set you free. So that's what this begins to look like for us. Now, again, let me make this really as practical as I can for you. We've been working on a version of this for about 7 years now, and keep in mind, COVID's in the midst of this. So over that time, this is literally how it's broken down for us. We've had hundreds, we've been blessed to have hundreds of folks do the Disciples Journey 1, and that's great. But then notice, we've gotten a lot of those people to take Disciples Journey 2. And when I say get them to take, here's much like if you're inviting someone to church, it might take 5 times, 6 times, 8 times to invite them before they say yes. One of the reasons we do this on a cyclical basis, on an annual basis, maybe somebody's not ready this year to take Disciples Journey 2. Maybe they're not ready next year, but then that third year from the asking, from whatever the ways God's been working in their life, maybe in year 3, they're ready to take it. Awesome. We've had that happen a number of times. And then similarly, you do 2, maybe you're not ready to go on to 3 right now. Maybe it's a year or 2 or 3 before that happens. But look what's happening as we go through this. It's literally acting like a funnel and narrowing it down so that we've had about 150 folks go through our Disciples Journey 2 over the years. But then it drops all the way. We've looked at this pretty carefully. 58 that have gone through our Disciples Journey 3. And these are people that we can trust in a lot of ways. They are embracing their giftedness in ways that we're excited about. And then look, it goes all the way down to 18 over these years. Now, on the one hand, you could say that's incredibly inefficient. That's a lot of time to only have 18. What I want to share with you, though, is our focus and our win is not necessarily the quantity, but the quality. And we really believe this. If Jesus could see the world be changed through partnering with 12 apostles, then we're pretty darn happy to have 18 or so that we believe are these game changer kind of people that can be set free and on fire for God. So we're okay with that. And then to also just give you some ideas, here are some of the things that have come out of these journeys. So one person is, she's leading Fresh Expressions for us of worship in a nursing home. That happened so notice she's not just a volunteer. Like, she's a leader being sent out and empowered permission. We've another individual, he just loved investing in men. And so talk about just investing in them and pouring into other men who could then in turn pour into other men. He set a lot of time aside to invest in them. We had one individual loves children who said, and just to walk with our kids, this is on the more formative side, but ended up creating a whole set of devotions that for our kids and our families to be able to walk through together. We have something in town called the Pajama Factory, and we've Fresh Expression leaders sent there. Youth ministry, I said youth ministry volunteers, but these are people meeting with our kids, walking with our kids, mentoring with our kids, and worship leaders and life group facilitators. In January, February, and March of every year, we have a Code Blue. We turn our facility into a Code Blue homeless shelter. The person who runs that came out of doing our Disciples Journey. Right now, Disciples Journey Step 1 that I said happens 3 times a year. None of us on staff lead that. Somebody who went through our Disciples Journey, she leads that. And she does a better job with that than any of the rest of us could. We recently just had a total redo of our contemporary worship experience. Somebody that went through our Disciples Journey through the creativity cohort, she spearheaded that and made that happen. So again, just to try to be super practical with you on what that begins to look like, that's been some of it. Let me give you a few thoughts here to leave you with, and then we'll pause together. So here's some things that I would suggest for all of us, no matter where you are, that I think you can take with you today. Number 1, you can be intentional. So again, are there clear entry points that are happening for you? If not, how can we make them more clear? Create something that is cyclical or annual. Like, don't just do the one-off, but something that's going to come back on a repeated basis. Valuing experience as much as information. And it's okay if it's going to be messy. Like, we expect that, but we're so good at the nice, neat, and tidy. I just don't think moving forward and all the change that we have going on that it can be as nice and neat and tidy as we like to make it. At the same time, we want to encourage as much alignment as possible. So this is not just the Lone Ranger making it happen. We literally every year, when it comes to Disciples Journey 2 and 3, we ask all of our staff or key volunteers or people that have gone through previous years, we reach out to them and we say, who can we tap on the shoulder this year? Who can you tap on the shoulder to be a part of this? And again, embracing quality over quantity, because Jesus did a whole lot with a few. And then also just keep raising expectations. Don't be afraid to raise those expectations. Those that don't want to do this, if we just make it comfortable enough, that's not going to be enough to persuade their hearts. And then shifting our mindset to embracing this more layered approach, valuing the formal over informal, and certainly leave space for God, because it is certainly going to be messy. So in terms of what is next, some things for you to think about. Do you have a version of Disciples Journey 2 or 3? Is it more formative that you need? Is it more generative that you need? Those entry points, how much alignment is there? And then what I would also say to you, starting in January of 2023, for any churches that are interested, I'm going to lead a cohort through this and really get into the nuts and bolts of literally the 6 sessions that we go through in the fall of every year for Disciples Journey 2, and then the 9 sessions in Disciples Journey 3. And I will literally walk through those sessions with people. So yes, it will take some time. But again, one of the things that we are convinced of is that discipleship takes time. And so, yes, it is a time commitment, but I'm currently doing that with one group, and it's really fun just to see what's emerging for them. But it's a chance to walk through step by step. Either you can take it as a leader, or if I know ahead of time that you would want to actually do this with a group of your folks, I would be happy to lead you through that as well. But this is the information you need, especially the link there at the bottom, freshexpressions.com/discipleship cohort. And I would love that opportunity to do that with you if anybody was so interested and inclined. So as we wrap up our time, I just want to say this. I know that it's a significant problem we face. We've observed that, and we've made some interpretations, but I think there's some steps we can take. I love the hope, though, that exists before us, and I love the possibility that exists before us. Dallas Willard called the lack of discipleship happening in the churches the non-discipleship of the church. This non-discipleship leads to most, I believe, if not all of the problems we have in our churches. But what would happen if we recovered discipleship in churches again? A recovery of discipleship would simultaneously begin to address so many of the problems that we have. And as Alan Hirsch says, imagine if we were to engage this journey of discipleship with the irreplaceable and lifelong task of becoming like Jesus and by embodying his message. When we do that, I believe there's just amazing opportunities before us. The last thing that I want to leave you with, this is one of my favorite discipleship videos. In 3 minutes, actually under 3 minutes, you're going to see what beautiful multiplying discipleship looks like. So let's watch this together, and then we'll have some conversation.
Ladies and gentlemen, at TED, we talk a lot about leadership and how to make a movement. So let's watch a movement happen, start to finish, in under 3 minutes and dissect some lessons from it. First, of course, you know, a leader needs the guts to stand out and be ridiculed. But what he's doing is so easy to follow. So here's his first follower with a crucial role. He's going to show everyone else how to follow. Now notice that the leader embraces him as an equal. So now it's not about the leader anymore. It's about them, plural. Now there he is calling to his friends. Now if you notice that the first follower is actually an underestimated form of leadership in itself. It takes guts to stand out like that. The first follower is what transforms a lone nut into a leader. And here comes a second follower. Now it's not a lone nut, it's not 2 nuts. 3 is a crowd, and a crowd is news. So a movement must be public. It's important to show not just the leader, but the followers, because you find that new followers emulate the followers, not the leader. Now here come 2 more people, and immediately after, 3 more people. Now we've got momentum. This is the tipping point. Now we've got a movement. So notice that as more people join in, it's less risky. So those that were sitting on the fence before now have no reason not to. They won't stand out. They won't be ridiculed, but they will be part of the in crowd if they hurry. So over the next minute, you'll see all of the those that prefer to stick with the crowd, because eventually they would be ridiculed for not joining in. And that's how you make a movement. But let's recap some lessons from this. So first, if you are the type, like the shirtless dancing guy, that is standing alone, remember the importance of nurturing your first few followers as equals. So it's clearly about the movement, not you. Okay, but we might have missed the real lesson here. The biggest lesson, if you noticed, did you catch it? Is that leadership is over-glorified. That yes, it was the shirtless guy was first, and he'll get all the credit. But it was really the first follower that transformed the lone nut into a leader. So as we're told that we should all be leaders, that would be really ineffective. If you really care about starting a movement, have the courage to follow and show others how to follow. And when you find a lone nut doing something great, have the guts to be the first one to stand up and join in. And what a perfect place to do that at TED. Thanks.
So I love that video for lots of reasons. And I think, for us, the real courage comes in our willingness to be the followers. And really, isn't that what discipleship is all about, is following Christ. And when we do that, and sometimes it's one-on-one and sometimes it's super messy, but if we do that and we're intentional and we're faithful, God does form a movement and God does do something significant. And there is a wave that is contagious and good and grace-filled. And we have that opportunity. And so I love discipleship. I love being part of it and just thinking about it. And I hope that you all do as well. So thank you so much for your time here today. I'm going to pause my screen here, and I saw some questions popping in a little bit, but I'm going to turn it over to Rachel. And
Yeah,
you can
I'm
just
going to
have
help
some
us. Absolutely. I'm going to help us through these questions that have been populated in the chat. If you all would like to ask continual questions, I actually have a handful of questions myself that I want to ask as well. Keep putting your questions in the chat and we will get to them. Some of these questions you may have already answered. First, let me just say, Matt, great presentation. That was awesome. And you gave us a lot to think about. And all of us are kind of wrestling out loud with what should we be doing next. And I love this information that you have given us and the challenge to think about discipleship in the future. Steve asks, are you able to share a more detailed description of this process in print? Having a concrete model would be very helpful. My assumption is you just want to say to Steve, hey, join my cohort. But
Hey, I mean, that would be great. But I'm actually happy. And Rachel, if I could ask you or Terry or some others to help me out when we're all done, if there's a specific request on materials, I am happy. We have an outline that breaks some of that down. We have something we call a scope and sequence that also breaks that down. That I think for Steve, that could be pretty helpful because it does show what we cover in each session.
So a couple of things kind of follow up to that. I saw someone asking, are these slides going to be available? Matt, can you make the slides available? So there are some detailed information when we kind of share out this presentation to everybody who signed up today. They can get that entire package of information. And I'm sure Terry can follow up with that. When we're talking about each one of these kind of steps in your process, who are the leaders in these steps? Is it staff? Is it laity? Who's leading?
Yep. So great. So for the step one, as I indicated before, it's a person who's not on staff. Her name is Michelle. She's one of our Disciples Journey 4 grads, if you call it that. And so she knows our DNA. We've learned that she just has a real passion for connecting with new people, and she loves the church, and she's super hospitable. And so she's the main one who helps get people to that first session, and she leads it. But when we do that in step one, like myself, I come once. We have 4 different folks who come through once. But then in step 2 and 3, if people take those steps, I lead that. And in our setting, we happen to have a teaching pastor. She does that as well. Now, I will say that that's a lot of time for her and I. But here, again, we think relationship is important. It's messy. It's not always as efficient as we want it to be. And here's the gift to me. And it lets me get to know anyone who does steps 2 and 3 in ways I never otherwise would. And so there's times I can't be with everyone the way I necessarily would want to be. Man, what a gift to be with those folks in those sessions, because I get to know them way better than we cover there what you can't cover with, hi, how are you on Sunday morning? Mm-hmm. So myself and her name is Janet, we lead 2 and 3. And then 4 is kind of its own thing. I do not lead 4. I do some touch points throughout a year where maybe we all come together just to say, updates on how it's going. But that's more of an individual mentoring that we put a person with the right person as they're going through their apprenticeship.
Oh, thank you for answering that question in that way. I want to kind of bring us back to some of the things you were talking about. A lot of churches kind of have a PhD in formation, but not necessarily have moved to this kind of sent ministry, if you will. What are some of the obstacles that you have had to overcome? Sometimes we call those fears or barriers or even excuses. What are you hearing from those folks? You had to move your congregation from like, hey, we want a Bible study to this kind of sent experience.
Yeah. And, to be really clear, I want, it's not like we've arrived. Like, it's not like, oh, this is from the past. Like it's pretty current. It's the ever ongoing, tide, as it were. But first of all, some of the things that were mentioned earlier, I just really resonated with, like good intention, good heart, but sort of the idea of like, we're good, we're not sure how to reach out to others. So why are we going to invest in that direction? Or, well, church is here. And if we're going to give to something, it needs to be here. Like, what's the return on my investment if we're doing things to reach them out there? Like, if I don't see them on Sunday morning, then it must not be valid or correct. Like, we used to talk a lot about, real church is on Sunday morning, and church light or church JV is, not as real out there. Like, it's just overcoming a lot of those mindsets. We've had to do a ton of both communication and teaching for our congregation on why this is important. And to be really clear, like, we're not actually, I would argue, we're not making this up. Like, if we look at the model of Christ himself, if we look at the model of the early church, like, I love Acts 2. Yes, they met in public religious spaces and they met in homes.
Yeah.
For years, I skipped the "and they met in homes" part. And so just helping our people understand, we're not making this up. We're actually reclaiming, we believe, what the church was intended to be. And here's the other thing. It's hard for people to argue if we're seeing diminished results. Well, they tend to be more open to trying something new then, because, hey, what we're currently doing just isn't working. And, for most of them, they can recognize, not everyone, but most of them can recognize, oh yeah, you're trying hard, or there's a product being produced, or you have decent leadership. Like, if those things aren't there, that's one thing. But if those things are in place and we're still not seeing results the way we would hope and pray, well, then we have got to be open to something new and different, or we're not going to be around here much longer. So it's kind of like a macro approach, which is why we do the sermon series and Bible studies, but it's also the micro approaches in our individual conversations, in time with staff and time with key volunteers, that this is just coming up on a regular basis so that we keep it in front of us. But it's that heart issue, which is just so hard at times to get around. But I really believe between the teaching and the conversation, and especially the prayer, and I guess I'll say one more thing. I am blessed in my situation, but if you're a pastor where you are, I don't always, I'll say this carefully, you don't always have to ask for permission to, like, I don't have to, like, we can sometimes just launch something or give somebody a permission to go ahead and do it and give blessing to that. And if static comes, I'll answer for that. And of course, I'm saying that within reason, but it's not like it has to go through 80 checkpoints before we say, this person might go on Tuesday evening to sit at this place to maybe have a conversation about faith. If it maybe comes up, like, just go do it and be blessed in that.
Yeah, that's awesome. I call that permission to play. Giving people
Yes.
permission to play.
Yeah.
I think Glenda's question really follows up this well. What does DJ1 look like in a more generative environment? They probably aren't coming to a church building for a new membership series, or are they?
So yeah, and if I don't answer this correctly, let me know. The way we currently do our Disciples Journey 1, most of that is like at the building. And the way that it's generative is not from the outward appearance, it's more the content we cover. So from the first time they meet, we talk about this idea of gathered and sent and what that means, and even about a little bit of APES stuff. Like, we want to remind people, you're not here just to consume and be comfortable. We're going to plant those seeds from moment one. So on the outside, it looks pretty like any other leadership or membership group. Now, I will say this, what's been more tricky to try to figure out has been, if there are people for us in our Acts network or those Fresh Expression worship groups, it is not going to work for them usually to come to us on a Sunday morning for the formal class. So in those cases, we've had to go to them and one of our main leaders and sit with them and have a conversation there and seek to go from there. Now, I will say this, even if we go meet them on their turf, we do emphasize to that we want to lift up in a positive way the gathered side of who we are. So even if you've never stepped foot in the church building on a Sunday morning, we don't want you to view them as enemy or negative. We actually want you to view them as brother or sister you just haven't met yet. And so it's not a bad thing for us to try to link those two together, even at a little bit, like, we're not going to force them to come on Sunday morning to worship or anything like that. But in the DNA of who we are, we at least want them to be praying for and view those folks who gather on a Sunday morning in a positive way. Because it's just like it's too easy to, if you're gathered on Sunday morning, to view those other people as them.
Yeah.
The opposite is also true. And so we're trying very hard to bridge the gap both ways.
Oh, that's really good. So you were talking about you yourself leading both like 2 and 3. How many people are you actually discipling in terms of your staff? I mean, this is a lot of folks. So
Sure.
who are you directly discipling?
So it depends on how many are in each group, but like right now, because we're doing this right. In fact, tonight we have this. There are 10 in our current Disciples Journey 2 group. So that's how many in this case. And then, I mean, the other probably main place that I meet with a lot of our staff, and I view that as discipleship opportunity. I mean, that's where I feel like I can help make some of the greatest influence. And we meet regularly. So staff and whichever discipleship group is going on at the moment would be the primary ones.
So when you think about the shift that you have made from formative to generative, what are the overall fruits that you're seeing, like for the entirety of your church?
Yeah, so a couple things. One would be just, I think, different mindset. Like we have a ways to go, but it increasingly sounds less strange to say, oh, we're doing church at Pajama Factory. We're doing church at a gym. We're like, that's ever so slowly sounding less weird. I count that a win.
Mhm.
And whoever asked about the slides, we'll be happy to send those so that you guys can share them. But if you look at the one slide in particular on the strengths of the gathered and the strengths of the sent, that for us has been significant fruit. Meaning, I'll put it this way, apostles and evangelists, awesome. They need to go out, spread the news, like they help the word grow, but they go wide. They don't necessarily go deep because that's not their gifting. You need
Mhm.
shepherds and you need teachers to help us go deep. Conversely, if you're a shepherd and teacher, you go deep, but we tend to not be as good at going out then in new life, right? So the fruit has been this synergy between the two to say each has gifts to bring. And therefore, if we can live into that, some great things happen. So here's an example. We've had traditional youth ministry in our setting for a long time. In fact, it's been one of the things that our church has hung its hat on. That was what I would call a traditional, established, gathered ministry because it was funded, it was programmed, everything in through the church facility. But when you infuse some of this apostolic sent DNA, we still meet on Sunday nights and Sunday morning, but now we have something called Faith Zone in our local middle school. And once a month, and there's some other extra dynamics to this, but once a month, our primary youth person gets to go to the middle school, and over the 3 different lunch periods, any student that wants to come and meet with her is welcome to do so. And we get anywhere from 50 to 80 students every month that comes to that. Now, that happened as a direct result of here's a traditional ministry, but if you infuse some of this sent DNA, what's another possibility of that? And that's exactly what's happened. And now actually, we're looking at doing this maybe at the high school, we're looking at other middle schools around us. I mean, it's just so exciting to think about like what the possibilities are. Here's another example. Traditional children's ministry does all the normal children's stuff, but there's a form of fresh expression called messy church. And you get to do some messy things with your kids. We are exploring what would it look like for some of our families of our kids who are in some of our traditional ministry. What would it look like to offer a form of messy church for them at a different time in a place where maybe some of their friends would want to come and gather as well? So again, a traditional ministry that's being infused with this sent DNA. And then conversely, you've got some people that are not connected with us, but one of the first baptisms that we had was from like when you're talking about fruit, we had a gentleman who was part of a local gym called the Fitness Factory. We were doing a worship experience there, a fresh expression. Long story short, he reached a place of desiring to be baptized. We did not force this, but he chose for a variety of reasons to come and be baptized on site with us on a Sunday morning. Again, that was his choice, not ours. But I think one of the reasons he did that, here's this larger body to belong to. And even if I don't know them, like, here's this group of saints that have either been praying for me or, that kind of thing. And so that was a great encouragement for our Sunday morning people, but it was also, I believe, a great encouragement to him, like he's being welcomed into this larger thing. So does that help? Like some of the, is that?
Oh, absolutely. There are a couple of things that you're saying as you're giving these examples. You're not saying, and 50 people and 25 people. You're saying, look, these are organic, fresh expressions, smaller groups of people, but it infuses the whole with a brand new DNA. And you have to be patient, but also super intentional, which, yeah, that's really, really good. It's interesting, at the beginning, you were talking about these tour guides, right? Westminster Abbey and tour guides. I'm really interested in, like, is there this movement in your church to create, I mean, that's what D4 sounds like to me, but to create more tour guides, because man, if we had more tour guides in the church, all heaven would break loose.
Yeah. And that's a great way to put it, Rachel. I hadn't thought of it quite that way, but that's really our goal. Like, so multiplying disciples, tour guides, like you're exactly right. Like, well, that's who we want them to be. And it's going to look a little bit different for each individual, but we are seeing some of that. So like, somebody said, what's a fruit of a generative example? The person who's in the nursing home leading, like, I'm never there, like never. She's the one serving, sharing in faith, discipling. That's awesome. Like, right. She's trying to be a tour guide with those folks in the nursing home. And that's what we're trying to raise up wherever we can. So I love that imagery that you gave.
Yeah. Terry, you have a great question here. I see many people wanting to learn in Bible studies, but they don't want to lead. Leadership kind of becomes that bad word in the church. They know they're supposed to lead, but they don't want to do it. How do you transition people into leaders?
Well, then we'll say, how about you serve in this way?
Yeah.
How about you serve by this? And actually, I say that there is some truth in that. Like, if somebody sees it as an opportunity to serve versus I'm the leader. But it's funny you asked that question about leadership. And I told you that we end up creating these profiles. One of the questions that we ask people, and this is in our Disciples Journey step 2, so fairly early on in the process, we literally say, scale of 1 to 10, how strongly do you see yourself as a leader and why? That question is helpful because it gives us a starting point to work with them from wherever they are. So quite honestly, when people say I'm a 9 or a 10, our thinking is, well, we got to work with you, but probably to scale you back. Like, you may not be quite all that. I mean, there's exceptions, but but conversely, the person who says I'm a 2 or 3 or no, it's our opportunity to say, actually, like, there's more to you than you even realize. And the form of leadership that you're probably revolting against, Jesus offers a different form of leadership, and it's this servant oriented. And so, what would that look like? So it gives us a chance. 1, we can affirm them more than maybe how they see themselves, but 2, in terms of how do we transition them, we try to name it for them. But it's also, this is the value of these groups are small enough to do some one-on-one talking, literally sit down with them either one-on-one or in the midst of just not this current one, but the last Disciples Journey 2 that we did. There was a gentleman in there that has such amazing, strong pastoral gifts, and he just could not see those gifts in himself. And he was saying something the one night, and there was this moment where we paused, and the group as a whole said, Jack, you are amazing at this. And you could just see him, like, for maybe one of the first times, receive that. And then we can work from there. So it's a combination of helping them understand and see gifts maybe they didn't see before. And then I would say appropriately challenging them to take their next step. We don't want to push you in the red zone, but just take your next step. And then here's the last piece of that. We tend to find that when people are super passionate about something, they might be willing to lead it and not even realize they're leading it because they're just so passionate about it. They just want to make it happen. So we won't call you a leader. If you could just be the person that makes that happen, that would be awesome. and go from there.
Oh, thank you so much, Matt. I see Susan Black, you have your hand raised. I'm going to give you an opportunity. I assume you want to make a comment.
I do. I have a comment and a question. So, still morning. Good morning, everybody. Hi, Matt. I'm Susan Black. I'm the executive director of the United Methodist Foundation of West Ohio. And so first of all, fantastic. I can't think of anything more important for us to be focused on than this work. So that's awesome. I have some questions. Yeah, really just some questions, I think. So first I'll give some context. So we are getting ready to launch our new stewardship education program. And the first phase of that program encourages churches to create an intentional discipleship system. And so, because I found as you did, as I was looking out, across all the various, resources and so forth, and ways that people could approach this, that discipleship was so integral to stewardship, that they were really hand in hand. So I'd love to hear anything that you have to say on that topic. And then secondly, the resource that we're primarily sending folks to is Discipleship Ministries and See All the People. And I'm sure you're probably very familiar with that. So I would love to hear any comparison or contrast you have to this work that you've done with the recommendations and See All the People, so that I can share that with folks and help them understand maybe what your resource also provides.
Sure. So let me ask, in regards to, I believe you said stewardship and like that connection with this discipleship for our congregation. Is that correct?
Right, that really discipleship is the way that stewardship increases. That really, when it comes to asking people to support the church, the only way that you're really ever going to grow that after a certain point is by growing people in their faith, and stewardship as a reaction to their faith and to their discipleship journey.
Yeah, thanks. So I think as you say that, a couple thoughts come to mind. One is, and this again, and I know I sound like I'm going to come back to this multiple times, but gathered and sent. So one of the gifts for folks on our more gathered side is, I would say that stewardship, as you're talking about it, they understand its importance. And one of the things that we try to emphasize with them is that when they take stewardship seriously from their experience and how they've grown in the church, that allows us to invest in this sent way to reach new people. And so that's the connection of stewardship there. And to be able to say to them, this makes a real difference in these people's lives. Like, it's great to say there's a program that's being produced, but when we can say, here's Mylan being baptized on a Sunday morning, because through your stewardship, we were able to send somebody who was properly equipped to meet Mylan on his turf and go from there. Like, those are game changer moments, so that the stewardship is hopefully seen as creating fertile ground for discipleship. On the other side, what we also try to do, in terms of stewardship with those on our sent side, that is not in their DNA to begin with. Like, that's not something that they first resonate with or understand, I should say, in terms of a life of faith, because they maybe haven't been walking a life of faith. So what we try to do with them is to start to raise how stewardship is important in their life as they grow in their discipleship. And so it becomes a sign of maturity for them that we then celebrate. And what we are also finding among some of our sent folks is, what's not overly meaningful to them is to say, hey, give money to an institution. Like that doesn't resonate. What does resonate, and we're totally playing around with this, but when we can go to a group and say, each group has its own personality and DNA, just like each individual does. If we can do something like, hey, is this group passionate about kids? Is this group passionate about homeless in our community? Or is this group passionate about feeding the hungry in our community? Like, let's just take those three. If the group says, oh, kids are our thing, well, then what we say as an invitation to stewardship is, here are ways, if you joining in this larger body, here are ways we're supporting kids or children. Would you be willing to, and you're giving, help us in that way by connecting around kids? That seems to have a stronger resonance with them, because it matches their passion, and they start to realize they can make a difference. It's not so much that like they're not generous, they just want their giving to make a difference in the area they're passionate with and for. So that's the connections I'd make on both sides of that with the issue of stewardship. And then I just want to make sure I get it right. You said in regards to your second question with Discipleship Ministries, can you just tell me the question you have there again?
Yeah, and I apologize. So United Methodist Church has something called Discipleship Ministries, and it's a wonderful resource. And they have a program called See All the People, which is a way for churches to tap into, learn how, and to create their own intentional discipleship system, which is essentially what you all have done. And, so anything, if you're familiar with that resource, do you have anything that you can compare and contrast with the work that you've done? If you're not familiar, that's okay, but just know that that's out there as well. So.
Yeah, thanks. So I don't know it overly well. And actually, I'm glad you mentioned that because I want to check that out more specifically, and I will do that. What I would say across the board, and maybe this is an exception here, so I'll say it carefully. But I mentioned when I was sharing with y'all earlier, the reason that we do Disciples Journey steps 3 and 4, which is more of a focus on practice and more of a focus on generative, is because inevitably in all the other discipleship programs I was seeing, discipleship program, we weren't seeing that. We were seeing the formation of good volunteers and maybe even rugged volunteers, but not what I would call disciples. So that's one piece. And the second thing I would say is it's just really tricky to do something too big without ignoring the contextualization that needs to happen. And so, that's where I think this gets most messy, is all of our churches are different sizes. And so how do we find the thing that's structured enough that helps all of us take a step forward, but flexible enough that it meets us where we are with our unique dynamics? But thank you so much for lifting that up. I really would love to look at that more carefully.
So Matt, I have one more question for you. I want you to lift up once again how people can get connected to your cohort, because I think we do have some interest when it comes to that cohort. So you could lift that up before we end our session today.
Absolutely. If you give me 1 second, I should have had that actually specifically written out. So
You're great.
Give me 1 second. And
Well, you know what? We will send the link. Terry will send the link out in our follow-up. So you don't have to have that in front of us, but just describe that to us.
Yes. Well, so the link, I'll just say the link though, since I do have it, freshexpressions.com/discipleship-cohort. So freshexpressions.com/discipleship-cohort. And yes, we'll make sure you get that link. But in terms of what it is, so I've said there's 6 sessions in Disciples Journey 2. I walk through the nuts and bolts of Disciples Journey, everything. And when I say nuts and bolts, I mean, we do everything from here's the pre-work that you do before session 1 happens. Here's the Bible study material that we cover, because it's always a combination of Bible study material and then like some of the things we've talked about today. It's always a marriage of those two things. And then here's, literally here are the exercises we do. Here's the information that's collected. Here's how that information is applied. We do that in steps 2 and 3. So if you're an individual, you would be equipped at the end of that to literally go do it yourself, start to finish in your setting. Or again, like I said, if we knew ahead of time and somebody wanted to say, well, I'll be there, but I'd like you to take our group through it. If I know that ahead of time, we can work in that direction as well.
Oh, that's fantastic. Matt, is there anything else you want to say?
First of all, just thanks. You all are awesome. Like I'm not joking. I love what you guys are doing some great things, and it's really fun to look out here and see some names that I know and some familiar connections. So first of all, thanks for that. And second of all, I'm biased, but like I think discipleship is so important. But here's the thing. I think we've turned discipleship into a program that almost sounds heavy, as opposed to discipleship is a way of life where there's an adventure to walk with Christ, to see this movement be unleashed. And I just think if we could approach it in that way, like there's so much excitement and possibility for God's church if we see it that way. And I hope that today's conversation allows us to think a little bit more in that direction, and maybe a step or two of what that could look like for each one of us. So blessings to you all. Thanks for the opportunity.
Matt, thank you so much. This has been incredible stuff. And I want to just say thank you to all you participants. I just love the way that you've given us so much feedback, and keep those questions coming. In fact, we'd love to hear your feedback. We're going to put a link in the chat, Multiply mini feedback survey. So just want to really encourage you to participate in that. The recording of this training will be available after today, and we'll try to get all the information that Matt talked about so that you can have that information for yourselves. You'll be getting this email follow-up with a survey, with a link to rewatch the training and all the material, and also a CEU credit, a certificate for you to fill out if you would like that credit. I just want to say thank you for being here. This has been really great, even for me. I've been taking all kinds of notes. So blessings to everybody who participated, and we're out.